Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our panel. Thank you for the participation here, and I think there's someone also online for this panel. We're going to focus on China carbon market. So we actually have 5 panelists. We have another online, is Professor Duan Maosheng from Tsinghua University, who is in charge of the negotiation of Article 6. So I'd love to kick off this topic from our presentation online, and each of the presenter will have 5 to 7 minutes to give their ideas, and we'll open up the floor afterwards for Q&A session. So I'm introduce myself, sorry. My name is Xiaolu Zhang. I'm the Climate Director of Environmental Defense from China. We are a US NGO, but we work internationally. So I personally has been involved into the carbon market design in China for over a decade, and I'll do a round introduction right now. Do we have Professor Duan right now already online? Yes, can you?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi.
Hello.
Do you want to introduce yourself very quickly? We'll do a round of introduction first.
Okay, no problem. My name is Duan Maosheng. I'm a professor at Tsinghua University. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Zhi Bin. I'm from International Carbon Action Partnership, ICAP. We are based in Berlin and focus on intergovernmental ETS cooperation. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Jack. I'm currently leading the Carbon and Energy Management Service for MUTEC. We're a sustainability service provider in China and also Southeast Asia. And we participate in the carbon trading market in China mainland. We both serve the compulsory market as well as the voluntary market. Thanks.
I'm Hugh Slater. I am a climate and energy specialist at Client Earth Beijing office. Thanks.
I'm Rishi Li from the ICF, and we are an international consulting companies with diverse expertise in the climate change and energy policy issues. Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction. So I'd love to welcome Professor Duan, who have in-depth understanding of Article 6 negotiation together with China's carbon market. And he'd love to share a little bit out of China's carbon market together with interaction with international market. Please.
Yeah, thank you, Xiaolu, for your introduction. So, you know that we have just concluded our discussion in COP27, and some agreement have been made there, and I think it's very useful that we highlight a few of the most recent development regarding a carbon market or market-based mechanism and the Paris Agreement. So you know that basically 2 mechanisms were established and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the 6.2, we call it cooperative approaches, and the 6.4 mechanisms. So those 2 mechanisms are different, but they are interlinked. So basically rules on 6.2 includes several mainly two aspects. One is the basic rules for decentralized mitigation cooperation between parties, as well as the review and reporting and review of the cooperation information. So the second part of 6.2 rules is regarding the monitoring of the international transfer and use of, we call it ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation credits. 6.4 basically is a centralized UN governance system for generating mitigation credits. So this is the difference, and the interconnection between 6.2 and 6.4 is that the monitoring rules establishing the 6.2 are also applicable to the 6.4 emission reduction credits. So I think this is the connection between the two. You know that avoidance of double counting is a very, very important requirement for both mechanisms. So this is the main difference between Article 6.4 mechanism and the KP's CDM, and it's very useful that I highlighted in COP27 7 parties agreed to divide the 6.4 emission reduction credits into 2 categories. The first category is authorized emission reduction credits, and the second category is mitigation contribution emission reduction credits. For the first category, the authorized emission reduction credits, they can be used towards NDC international mitigation purposes, while for the mitigation contribution emission reduction credits, they could be used for many other purposes. For example, result-based finance, domestic carbon pricing scheme, or domestic pricing based measures. I mean, this is very important. For example, if a host party do not wish to establish its own domestic baseline and crediting system, they can rely on the 6.4 mechanism for generating the credits. I think this is very important. And also for the mitigation contribution emission reduction credits, a corresponding adjustment is not required for the host party. This is very important. If for example, if say corresponding adjustment will also be required for the use of mitigation contribution emission reduction credits, basically the host country will not approve the use of such kind of credits, because I mean once they use the credits, they will their national emissions level will increase by several percent. I think this is a negative incentive. So at Sharm el-Sheikh, we agreed that well, corresponding adjustment will not be applied to the use of mitigation contribution 6.4 emission reduction credit. I think this is very important. And for the Chinese national carbon market, we know that covered entities can use up to 5% of the emissions for offsetting purposes. But I mean, currently the supply is very limited. The total supply is about 70 million, and you know that even for the sole power generation sector, the annual emissions is more than 4.5 billion. So you know, even for this sector, 5% basically means more than 200 million credits, but the total supply is about 70%. So we think 6.4 and 6.2 is very, very important for China for China's covered entities to use offsetting credits towards their emissions, their allowances surrender obligation. And I think this is very important. And we know that while China in the past several years has been working very hard to restart its domestic voluntary mitigation system, but there are a lot of difficulties, and we're still in the process of refining the system design. And now we have the 6.2 and 6.4. But for 6.2, it's a little bit complicated because it's a bilateral cooperation mechanism, and it will require the host party to do a lot of things. For example, not only the designated national authority, but also a lot of basic infrastructures. For example, a registry system. I don't think China in the short term can fulfill the requirement to participate or to make use of 6.2. But 6.4, I think it's much easier for China to use, especially in Sharm el-Sheikh. We agree that we allow parties to use the mitigation contribution emission reduction credits without the application of corresponding adjustment. I think this is the just concluded meeting actually has provided a very, very solid basis for China to utilize UN system for its domestic ETS purpose. So Xiaolu, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Duan, for a very in-depth discussion and introduction of Article 6 negotiation progress and how China is going to use that to think forward. And I see a lot of faces here participating, and I want to just briefly introduce carbon market in case you are not really follow Chinese carbon market. China has launched its carbon market last year around July. It covers the year of 2019 and 2020. It's 2-year compliance cycle. So right now it's the second compliance cycle for China's carbon market. China's national carbon market covers power sector only, but it's around 40% of China's total carbon emission, about 4 to 4.5 billion tons of CO2 per year. So the compliance obligation means around 2,000 power companies around China will participate in this cycle. So we've seen the first year compliance rate, it's about 99.5 compliance rate based on the number of allowance. So the second speaker, I'd love to welcome Chen Zhibin, who will give us a introduction and discussion on the allocation plan that called for public consultation last month.
Thank you, Xiaolu. And my slide, please. Yeah, this one. Hi, everyone. I will give you a brief introduction of the recently released allocation plan draft for the second compliance cycle. It will cover the emission in 2021 and 2022. So let's start. Next slide, please. It is the general idea of how we calculate the allowance for each power generator. We don't have to go to the technical details, but the basic idea is we calculate the allowance for the electricity and the heat separately. We will have a benchmark for the heat and for the electricity, and then we will have is an output base. So we will use the actual heat production or electricity production to calculate the final allowance. So yeah, basically we just put the benchmark times the actual production for electricity and for heat and sum up these two parts together, and then we can get the actual allowance for each generator. So if a company has 2 generators, you will calculate the allowance for each part and for each generator, and then add up to its the overall allowance for one company. And then is for China, the cap is the cap setting is bottom-up approach. So the government will calculate the allowance for each company and then sum up as the cap for the whole national ETS. So that's the basic idea. And in the second compliance circle, the equation is almost the same as the first one, but there are also some changes. Next slide, please. Yes. So the major change is the significant tighter benchmark. Compared to the first compliance circle, the benchmark declined like around 10% or even more than 10% for coal-fired generator. So I think that reflects the progress of the China power sector. The benchmark from the first compliance cycle are based historical data around 2017, 2018, and these benchmark, the one you're seeing, the draft value, is based on the emission data in 2021. So during these several years, 2 things happened. The first one is the power sector. They focus more on carbon reduction. They all organize their professional carbon management team or carbon management company to implement some to energy efficient promotion project, so they can increase the energy efficiency and carbon efficiency. So the carbon intensity reduced after 3 or 4 years. So that's part of the reason. And another reason is how we measure the emission. So at the first compliance cycle, there are around 40% of company, they don't use actual emission of their emission factor. But in recent time, only less than 10% will use the default value. So if you calculate the actual emission factor, the number is like 10 to 20% less than with the default value. So I think these two things, the one is the actual improvement of energy and carbon efficiency. The other one is the more accurate actual monitor. These two things reduce the intensity of power sector, and that reflects in the benchmark. And so we can see the benchmark is like 10%, 12% less than the first compliance cycle. So it's one major change, and also we can see the Chinese MRV system is improving. Next slide, please. And there are also other changes. The load factor adjustment is a little bit technical. It means if the generator it runs like not as much as it designed, like maybe less than 85% of its design capacity, you will receive a little bit more allowance from the government. And yes, because some Chinese generator, they cannot decide their own running time. So the grid will give them how much they can run, and that will affect the efficiency. So if the generator is like 85%, less than 85% of its design capacity, the efficiency is not that high. So the government will adjust this situation by giving them a little bit more allowance. And before, in the first compliance cycle, this adjustment only happened in 100% electricity generator. But now, these cogeneration plants, they provide heat and electricity together. They can also receive this adjustment. And another thing is the updating of the baseline year for pre-allocation. So because the China ETS is based on actual emission, and now when the government calculates the allowance, we don't know the actual emission from 2022 because it's not finished yet. So the government will pre-allocate the allowance based on the 2021 emission. Yeah, and that's the update. You can give the company so even though we are in a 2-year compliance cycle, but they can receive some allowance advance, and then they can start the trading. And that's the update of the baseline year. So these are the major changes of the allocation method, and there are still some uncertainties because it's still a draft. It's not official approved. We are waiting to see the final version. And there are some uncertainties. The first one is the flexibility policies of banking, compliance, obligation, and offsets. In the draft allocation, the MEE said the banking rules will be released later separately. So there's a little bit uncertainty about the vintage allowance from the first compliance cycle. So yeah, and we are waiting to see what will happen for those vintage allowance. And also the compliance obligation. In the first compliance cycle, the coal-fired generator, their compliance obligation is up to 20%, which means if you have shortage more than 20%, you you only have to buy 20%. That's okay. You don't have to like buy the maybe 30, 40. No, not that much. So it's kind of a protection for the industry. But this is the first compliance cycle. We don't know what will happen in the second one. So maybe in the second one, they will cancel it or they will change it. It's not decided yet. And also the offsets, we know in the first compliance cycle, we can use vintage CCER and with no limitation. But now, maybe there will be some changes of the offset rules. And that's also important to the market. And also the timeline of actual allocation and what time to start trading is not clear yet. And but MEE already received the opinions from the industry, and I think they will have the final version soon after COP. So let's see. And that's my presentation. And next slide, please. You can find more information about the China ETS and the allocation plan in our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jibin, for the really in detailed introduction of the new draft allocation plan. And I'll skip Hai for a little bit and introduce Hugh Slater. He's going to introduce the result of China Carbon Survey, which is a long time project that he's been involved in, representing a lot of the industry officials and experts' voice on carbon pricing in China.
Thanks very much, Lulu. And thank you also to the organizers of the conference. It's great to be able to meet in person with everyone again after a few years' break. We have the slides? Great. So Rhys and I are going to share some of the initial results from our latest China carbon pricing survey. So this is an exercise that we've been conducting since 2013, when the regional pilot markets were just getting started in China. And it's matured and grown since then. It's now being led by ICF, where Racine is working in the Beijing office, funded by EDF and Energy Foundation. We very much appreciate their support. We started off surveying at a point where the pilot markets in China hadn't begun trading yet, and the community of stakeholders in China in the carbon market really were primarily CDM traders who were looking forward to sort of the growth of compliance markets. We had about 80 respondents at that point. We're now tracking stakeholders across compliance entities, expert groups, think tanks, all of that kind of thing. But we're primarily covering those covered entities in both the national and the regional markets now. We're getting about 500 respondents every year, which gives us quite a good data set over almost 10 years now. The report has not been released yet. We've just finished conducting the survey in early November. But for those that are interested in receiving a copy when it does come out in the coming weeks, it will be on the China Carbon Forum website. But perhaps the best way, if you are interested, is come up to me after the presentation and exchange emails, and we can make sure that you get a copy. I'm just going to mention a few of the most interesting results today, and Racine will cover a few more. This survey goes into a lot of depth about price expectations, design expectations for the national ETS in terms of allocation mechanism, monitoring reporting processes, when can we expect auctioning and those kinds of things in the national market. We also ask about readiness of companies, where they need extra capacity building, all of that kind of stuff. But I'll just cover a few of the things that I think are most interesting in this year's survey. If I can have the next slide. So this year we have 465 respondents, which is the second highest rate that we've had so far. You can see the most respondents come from that power generation sector across the country, really. So we're getting good response rates from those entities that are both very experienced in the carbon market and covered by pilot schemes, as well as entities in provinces that have not had a carbon market until last year. That gives quite a range of experience and differences in expectations from the carbon market, as you can imagine. Next slide, please. So just briefly, we still do ask about expectations of the pilot markets because while the national market obviously gets a lot of attention, it's the biggest carbon market in the world in terms of coverage now. The pilot regional markets are also still very important because they cover a much broader range of sectors. They also have quite different designs, so you get interesting aspects around participants in the market, different products, carbon financial products in different markets, and so it's interesting to keep monitoring the pilots because aspects of that will inevitably inform how the national market develops. Price expectations. Check. Price expectations over the next sort of decade, compared to our survey from last year, we're seeing price expectations in the order of sort of 10 to 20 RMB higher than we had about a year ago when we did the survey last time, which is interesting. And I won't get too much into interpretation, but rather just provide you some results. We can talk about interpretation in the Q&A, I guess. Next slide. National price expectations compared to the previous year. So when the national carbon market started in the middle of last year, we're actually our respondents did a very good job of predicting where the price point would start. They got it bang on, pretty much. For this year's survey, we're seeing price expectations for this year about 10 RMB higher than we had for last year's survey, about the same for mid-decade, and about 10 RMB lower than in 2030. So I'm not sure if you can see here, but the green line is the average and the blue is the median, and then you have a 20th to 80th percentile range. Obviously, as you start getting out to longer distances ahead, you get a very wide range of expectations. So you can take it with a grain of salt, but it's the point is we want to try and look at the role of carbon pricing in China's sort of mid to long-term decarbonization strategies, even if those they're not predictions, they're expectations from our respondents, may not be 100% reliable for 30 years in the future. Next slide. We ask, one of the interesting things I think is about the benchmarks. We just heard from Zhibin that there's been, the draft of the new allocation plan. We asked this question of our respondents a little bit before that came out. On the left, you have opinions with regard to the benchmark for installations that are below 300 megawatts, and on the right, above 300 megawatts. So we have these two separate benchmarks. You can get a sense. I mean, the dark blue is the entities that have been covered by pilot markets, so have more experience in the carbon market, and the light blue is non-pilot entities. The only real sort of differences I think you can pull out perhaps are that there is a slightly higher proportion of pilot entities that think that the smaller entities benchmark was too generous, and kind of the opposite for the the non-pilot entities think that the benchmarks for the big installations were too strict. Interestingly, from the new benchmarks, we see a slightly more higher. Can you say a higher decrease in the benchmark for the smaller entities, which perhaps reflects that the benchmarks for those smaller entities were a little too generous. Next slide. before I pass it on to Rui-Sin. We ask every year about expectations of impacts on investment from the carbon price in China. Our respondents expect that by next year, over half of our respondents expect that the carbon price will be having at least a moderate impact on investment decisions for covered entities, and that sort of grows over time, as you can see. I believe that's my last slide. Just check. Is there any more slides? Oh, yep, sorry, one more, CBAM. So we started asking this last year because it's obviously a topic of high interest. Sorry, it's not labeled well, but on the left is the amount of respondents whose companies export to Europe for the relevant sectors that are covered by CBAM at the moment. So about 15% of those. And then of those, we ask, how well do you understand CBAM? That's the middle one. And so you can see that well over a majority only have a slight real understanding of CBAM, if at all. A minority really understand it very well. But despite that, well over a majority expect that on the right here that it will impact on their exports to Europe. A very large majority think that it will. Now, Lulu talked a little bit about this in yesterday's workshop, this sort of pairing of a low understanding of how CBAM works and what it means, but a very strong confidence that will impact on exporters' operations, I think is an interesting dynamic that we'll need to work hard to address in the coming sort of couple of years. Okay, I'll hand over to Rui-Sin now.
Yeah, thanks you for mentioning some our initial results from this year's survey, and I would also like to share some extra survey initial results, which I think it may reflect some perspectives from industrial sectors. So as mentioned by Xiaolu earlier, so maybe you all know that the China's national ETS now is only cover the power sector, and according to the plan of the China's Ministry of Ecology and the Environment, so the idea is that China's national ETS will cover the power sector initially, and then gradually to include the other emitting sectors one by one. And so we also include a question in the survey to every year to test the people's expectations in terms of the year that they think by when so other emitting sectors would be able to join the national ETS. So from the survey result over the years, so after the power sector, it seems that the cement and the iron and steel and the aluminum sectors stand out in terms of the perceived carbon market readiness, which means the industry have been prepared very well. And in last year's survey, so over a third of the respondents think that these three sectors should be ready to join the national ETS as early as 2022, which is this year. And but the weighted average of expectation is being that so these three sectors will be included by the 2023. And according to this year's survey, so the initial result presents that the expectation of the cement sector and the iron and steel sectors to be included in the year of the 2023 did not change. But the thing is that for the aluminum sector, so last year the expectation is that we have 1/3 of the respondents who think that it may be included soon. But for this year, the result slightly dropped to about around 1/4. We did not analyze this change yet, but personally, I think so. I think that the one possible reason is that last year, actually, we received quite a lot of response from aluminum sectors, which may reflect the strong confidence within the sectors. So more detailed information, I think we will do some further analysis and to include the detailed information in the final report of this year's survey, which is expected to be published in a couple of months. And but I think overall, there are still around 80% of the respondents who believe that these three sectors should be, which means the cement, the iron, steel, and the aluminum, would be included by the China's national ETS no later than no later than 2025. And this is also in line with the result and the feedback we have received through a series of discussion and roundtables we have previously organized with some industry associations. So apart from the key emitting sectors, so China's national ETS is also expected to include some other non-emitting sectors such as professional trading companies and institutional investors. So this kind of the stakeholders also show some strong interest in the forward China's national ETS. And last October, so actually, so we also include some questions to test the people's view and expectations. And so generally, I think around 40% of the respondents think that the non-industry sectors should be allowed to join the national ETS only after 2025, while 30% of the respondents believe that they should be joined the market as soon as possible. This is quite a divided result. And we also categorize the respondents by their practical experience to see if there is any possible or potential reason to cause this division. And over a third of respondents from the enterprise who has been involved in the national ETS think that the non-industry sector should be included as soon as possible. This percentage is a bit higher than the general level. Well over 30% of the enterprises who has been involved in the regional pilot ETS think that the non-industry sectors should be included only after 2025. Another point I would like to mention a bit is the role of the voluntary carbon market and in companies' net zero strategies and the market expectations. Like Zhibin also mentioned earlier, is that the CCER last year, the last October, China's Ministry of Ecology and the Environment has issued a notice to allow the CCER to be used for the first compliance cycle. Of course, with a certain degree of restrictions in terms of percentage. And now many market participants and stakeholders are keeping an eye on the progress of China's CCER's market, and if it could be allowed to use for the second or for the next compliance cycle again. So we asked respondents in the survey to if their companies purchase some carbon offset credits. The percentage respondents that choose no to saying that they did not purchase any offset products is still quite high, and only around 60% of the respondents said that okay, their company purchased some carbon offsetting credits. And of course, among others, CCER is the most popular tab in China's market. And around 90% of the respondents said that their companies had purchased the CCER to offset their enterprises' emissions or to use for their compliance. So the second popular credits production is validated by the local authorities. Something like in Guangdong province, we have some Tanpuhui credits, and we have some similar products in other provinces. And only 9 respondents said that their companies purchased VCS and Gold Standard. So apart from CCERs, more than a half of respondents expect that. So after this, from the next compliance cycles, besides the CCERs and some local carbon credits that are validated by the local authorities, should also be introduced and allowed to use. For surrendering in the China's national ETS. And it is noted that over 45% of the respondents think that VCS should also be introduced into the China's national ETS. And only 7% of the respondents think that CCER should be the only one eligible credits for the national ETS. So when we asked the expected restrictions in terms of the use of the offset credits in the China's national ETS, around half of respondents think that the percentage limitations and the vintage year should be the most possible restrictions. And some other respondents also mentioned some other elements that may be taken into account, such as the required social benefits of the projects they may have. Yeah, and I think about is that I want to introduce today, and I will give the microphone to Jack.
Thank you. Just want to clarify one thing. Like when we talk about industry, China's plan is to include all 8 industries other than power. They are cement, aluminium, iron, steel. These 3 are the 3 that we think it's going to be included first, and then it's petrochemical, paper making, and aviation. They together represent about 70% of China's total primary energy carbon emission. Anything to add? No? Okay. I'd love to welcome Jack Hai from Mill Tech to share his view on the Chinese carbon market from a private sector perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lou, for inviting me here. Definitely, we're from the private sector. I'm a private company, so we're not the policymakers. So all the points that I'm going to say is only on behalf of myself. So as we know that for Chinese carbon market is actually dominant or driven by the compliance market, to be honest, both for CEA, which is the Chinese China Emission Allowance, and also CCER. So recently, as Zhibin mentioned, that the government released the CEA allocation scheme as well as the MRV's guidance, and we have some observation from that. The first observation, I think, is that most of the terms and requirements for this new compliance cycle actually remains the same compared to the last compliance cycle. Although that we see that the benchmark intensity of emission actually reduced by 8% on average. However, that's a result of the improvement of data quality of the coal carbon content intensity. So as Zhibin mentioned, previously there's only around 60% of the power plants actually measuring their actual data for the coal carbon intensity inside their coal. But right now this number increased to around 90%. So the accuracy actually improved, and also it's more reflecting the truth right now. So although it's an 8% of the decrease on average, however, the actual impact is quite small. We see that also there's a kind of a trend and encouragement mentioned by Hugh that for those more advanced and also energy efficient power plants, actually the impact is below 1%. It's around like 0.1% for the actual allowance gap or shortage. However, for those very old power generation plants, like for CFB boilers, the shortage of allowance is around like 2.5%. So that's an indication from the government saying that, okay, we want to decommission these kind of old power generation plants. So that's the first observation. The second observation is that although the majority of the terms remain the same, however, there are some still minor changes. For example, this is actually the first time that the government mentioned the treatment or usage of the residual allowance from the past or previous compliance cycle. Although there's no details for now, but I think it's a signal or it's a sign, right? So for those huge companies who have quite a lot of CEAs from the past compliance cycle in hand, maybe their future trading strategy will be impacted and will be changed, right? The third observation I have is that probably we can draw some experience from our Chinese local carbon trading market. Right now in China, we have 7 regional carbon markets. If you include the market in Sichuan and Fujian, then there are totally 9 carbon trading markets. All these from the allowance allocation scheme to the actual surrender process actually is quite different from the national market. Let's say for Guangzhou market, right? They have the auction scheme, so up to from 3 to 5% of the allowance will be through auction scheme. And also for these compliance cycle in Guangzhou, they also introduced 3 more industries, including textile, ceramics, and also a data center. So I believe that this is a kind of trend in the future that probably can act as a reference for the national carbon trading market as well. The last one is actually I want to talk about the carbon credits market in China, which is the CCER. As a lot of speakers also mentioned that CCER it can be applied to both the voluntary market as well as the compliance market. However, the majority of the consumption actually is consumed by the compliance market, to be honest. We see that actually, there are some trends as well for the CCR market. Previously, there are around 200 methodologies before the close or shutdown of the CCR market. But recently, everyone is urging about the reopening of the CCR schemes. And we see that probably in the future, there will be largely reduction of the number of methodologies behind. Probably there's only 10 to 20 huge methodologies or combined methodologies. That's the first. The second is that we see there are quite a lot of shortage in terms of the compliance surrender, right? So as mentioned before, CCR can use to fulfill the allowance gap or shortage. And this time, actually, within the CEA allocation scheme, there's a new factor or definition has been introduced. That is the balance factor or break-even factor, right? So from this, we can actually calculate the national shortage on CEA allowance. And the number is around 70 million ton of carbon emission or of allowance. So these can be only fulfilled by using the previous cycle's residual CEA or fulfilled by CCER. So I think right now on Chinese market, the tradable or usable CCER's volume is only less than 10 million ton. So there's a huge gap actually. So we see that there are a lot of people urging for the reopening of the CCR market just to fulfill this gap. And also probably in the future or in the near future, right, there will be 7 more industries covered in Chinese ETS market. And this will also increase the demand for the CCR market as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for sharing the view. I'd love to open the floor for any questions. We can have 2 questions at the same time, and please go first, this gentleman. Another one? Oh, microphone. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks so much for a great panel and great content. Really, really enjoyed that. My name is Malik. I'm from Shell, looking at carbon pricing. I guess I just had a couple of reflections, just kind of building on what's been said, and really it's open to all. The first one is Article 6.2. We heard this morning in the plenary that China is looking to possibly be a buyer of Article 6.2 credits. If you have any reflections on what that could look like, or any insights from your own point of view, that'd be much appreciated. The second one is really enjoyed the content on CBAM, where that's something that's developing. And some that do trade with the EU, are slightly aware. I think if there's any further insights that you can share in terms of, the next 3-year timeline where it's just reporting but not implementation, how looking to operationalize that. And Hugh, sorry, this is a very technical question, but your price forecasts, were they real terms or money of the day? If that's possible. Those are my questions.
Thank you. I'd love to call Professor Duan, whether you're still online.
Still here. So on 6.2, well, that's at least middle-term vision. I don't think we can make use of 6.2 in the short term. As you can see, I think one of the difference between 6.0 and 6.4 is that 6.2 gives a lot of flexibility to the cooperating parties. But at the same time, it basically requires the cooperating parties to do a lot, much more than what is required under 6.4. First, they need to reach agreement how to, for example, on a lot of things, methodologies, how to divide those emission reduction credits. I mean, a lot of things, and how to apply the corresponding adjustment provisions. So I don't think China can apply or benefit from 6.2 in the near future. I think the most optimistic projection, or maybe we can benefit from 6.4 in the next 2-3 years. Thank you.
Professor Duan, you are one of the top experts and researchers on the topic of CBAM. We have a question about CBAM. Do you want to share your view?
Well, for CBAM, I think first, I mean, we need to divide the issue into different levels. From the political level, we for sure we don't agree with that idea, and then I mean we don't think the proposal is consistent with the WTO rules and the principles enshrined in the convention. I think that's the first one. But at the technical level, for sure, relevant Chinese industries or sectors, they are making preparations. They are monitoring their product emissions. They are also establishing their MRV systems, and also some of the companies they may have several or a lot of manufacturers for the same product. So they may wish to restructure which product will produce which production line will produce the product to be exported to certain countries. I think about that, or even to redistribute their production lines to other regions. So I think there are a lot of things they are doing, but besides what can be done by the sectors or enterprises, I think it's also very important that the industry associations or even the authorities, they can facilitate some of the efforts by the enterprises or the sectors. For example, if at the end of the day the enterprises will have to apply a default value or benchmark at the industry level, maybe it's more appropriate that the authority or the industry association can do this rather than the enterprises themselves.
Thank you, Professor Duan. Any comment from the panelists and also your question?
Thanks. To address the technical question first, so the price charts do not adjust for inflation. It's worth remembering that rather than projections based on a model, these are answers to a questionnaire. So you get direct expectations at different price points. There are, of course, others out there that do projections based on modeling and various expectations. The likes of Refinitiv and market analysts like that are producing those kinds of outlooks on the Chinese market. This is a qualitatively different kind of a result. Just on CBAM, I think we've been engaged in a lot of both sort of public and private conversations with various stakeholders, and I think you get different answers in different contexts from Chinese stakeholders, because necessarily there's some sort of politics involved in this question. A workshop recently, one of the large Chinese industrial enterprises had done quite a bit of analysis on the expected impact on their operations, and we're saying, look, well, we expect, in practicality, we expect some impact financially on our exports to Europe, but it's most likely to make us more competitive than some of our other competing exporters to Europe. So I think there's some pragmatic thinking about the issue, but of course there's a lot of smaller enterprises out there that perhaps haven't had the same capacity to do that analysis and may have different views. So we can continue the discussions, and I think it's really important for Europe and China to deepen those discussions, not just in a one-way direction, but to have a broader discussion between both sides around the issue of carbon leakage, and try and depoliticize this issue as much as possible, and consider the options from a environmental and climate perspective rather than a sort of get distracted by geopolitics. That's my opinion anyway.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Do we receive any online questions or any of the comments from our panelists? Okay, please. There's one question, and then here's the gentleman. We'll collect two questions together. Thank you. Can I have the question?
Yeah, a question for the panel, but also for Jack. You mentioned on CCERs, and they'll shrink the methodologies that are currently available since issuance, and you mentioned a number around 10 million tons or so. Where was that number from in terms of actual CCR demand or supply rather that's out there?
Jack, do you want to take the question first?
Yes. So actually, the shrink of the methodology for CCR, that's kind of a talk right now. There's no official news right now. We are expecting the CCR market to be reopened at the end of this year or next year, because there's definitely a shortage in terms of the volume to fulfill for the next compliance cycle, right? We are expecting some of the previous outdated methodologies to be reduced and also to be updated for certain methodologies. For example, for the project establishment time or date, according to the previous methodology, that was, any project that after 2005 can be, a credit. But right now, I think there's talk that we want to extend this timeline to 2013 or even to 2016. Probably that's the current involvement. And also, in regarding to the actual trading volume or the demand, before the actual suspension of CCR scheme, right now, in the market, there were around 50 million ton of CCRs that's tradable, that can be used. Sorry, 50 or 80 million, I think. I cannot remember exactly. And for the first compliance cycle, I think half of them has been kind of retired. And then right now, for the rest, most of them are kind of in the hand of the big five utility companies in China, as well as for some private sector, private agents. But also we see there are a lot of demand as well, not only for the 70 million CA shortage for the next compliance cycle, but also there are a lot of rooms for arbitrage, right, for between CEA and also the CCR. So the total demand we calculate is around 0.25 billion ton of CCR that is required if you also consider the arbitrage demand. Yeah, so I think there are quite a lot of demand and room there. And also probably within the next 4 years, which is Chinese 14th five-year plan, probably the rest 7 industries or regulated industries will be covered by the CEA or ETS market. So that probably we see there's a growing demand in the future.
Just on that first question, I think there's clearly a role for financial institutions to play the kind of role that you were talking about. To date, there has been more of a role for those kind of for financial institutions to play that kind of role at the pilot level, and including a little bit more openness to sort of foreign institutions as well. But at the national level, it's taking a very steady, step-by-step process to maturing, and I wouldn't expect, very sudden developments in that space, but keep an eye out. One thing I forgot to mention was that the data set that we collect for our survey is available to people that are interested. There's already financial institutions that use it for as reference points for some of their analysis. So anyone that's interested in that, we can provide the data set. I was actually going to suggest that Xiaolu should also be given an opportunity to talk about some of these questions, because you're also an expert on all of these things we've discussed, rather than just a moderator. But I don't know whether you have thoughts to add.
Thank you. So I think I'll just briefly talk about, because the data actually right now the registry of CCR is under an institution called NCSC. That's a affiliated organization under the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, which is the competent authority of climate change issue together with carbon market. So they issue the data, like how much money, how much allowance, or how much CCER has been on the market, and how many has been used. So you can track that information there. And about financial institutions, I really agree. Financial institutions right now are not allowed to trade or open account in the national carbon market, as well as individual investors. But in the pilots, they are allowed. So there are talks about how to involve financial institutions into the market to boost the liquidity and to help more people participate into the market. And right now, the industry emission exchange has been working on that together with the government. So we're looking for more development. I want to welcome the final words from our experts. If you want to have something pressing to say, or you want to give us a final thoughts, 1 sentence per person. Do we still have Professor Duan online?
Yes, I'm still here. I think we should be patient for the development or improvement of the Chinese carbon market. Thank you.
Thank you. 1 sentence per person.
I think the Chinese government, the Chinese national ETS will have a big change after we peak our emissions. So during this procedure, we will see the change step by step. Yeah.
Thank you, Jack.
Let's try to switch to Chinese next time. Just kidding. Actually, Chinese carbon market is only is at a very early stage, and there are a lot of things that we can learn from the Western world and also from the piloting market. So we're expecting to see quite a lot of upgrading in the near future. Yeah.
Thank you. Hugh?
Check. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one really interesting thing to watch in the next year or two, we talked about it yesterday in a workshop, is about the interaction between power market reform and the carbon market reform. Those two things really are going to be very important to each other. So we'll be watching that very closely.
Thank you.
And also to address a bit the questions regarding the financial institution roles, I think there we see a lot of the discussions also in terms of the oversight of market risk. And so I think we need to, there may be some balance between to involve more sectors, including financial sectors, and to prevent the market risk. So I think this is also step-by-step progress, and let's see.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of our panelists. Please join me for a round of applause, and thank you all for joining our discussion. If you're interested in this topic, and please grab our speakers when they go down the stage. Thank you.